Hey guys, I'm live. So as you know, my board exams just ended 4 days back, and now I'm participating in the Skillcraft Open and the Delhi International Open, which start from the 19th and the 20th for the Skillcraft and 22nd to 29th for the Delhi International Open. And as you can realize, I really need to prepare a lot for them. And I played a few games a while back, and my middle game is still alright, but my openings and endgame are just haywire. And for endgame especially, I really need to work a lot because right now I'm completely out of form, and without complete understanding of the end games, I won't be able to play too well and would end up decreasing way too much rating. And hence I'm going to go over the book Understanding Chess Endgames. This is written by John Nunn, who's a renowned author, and it features the 100 most important endgame ideas from which all of us can learn and really improve our endgame by a lot. So that's the main motive of today's stream, and I'll be continuing with this stream for a long time, and we'll be going over this entire book and try to just improve our chess through it. And this live stream will be available later as well, so you can of course go over it if you want to just have a video and or over the board way of actually just going over the entire book fast. Without any further ado, let's start with the content. Today's main focus is king pawn endgames, so let's begin. This is what the book's cover page looks like, and then here's the index. So the contents are firstly king and pawn endings, wherein we'll include the king and pawn versus king, the rook spawn, king and two pawns versus king, shouldering away, king geometry, extra pawn, outside pass pawn, protected pass pawns, active king, breakthrough, opposition, distant opposition, triangulation, reserve tempi, transformation to a queen ending, transformation to a queen ending again, and surprise moves. After this, we'll also go over knight endings, same colored bishop endgames, opposite colored bishop endgames, bishop versus knight endgames, rook endings, rook versus minor piece endings, and queen endings, and lastly, other material combinations, which will be followed by some tactical ideas. Here are some important symbols which all of you must know about. These are pretty general, so I won't be explaining them. This is the introduction, which we'll be skipping to save a bit of time. Now let's begin with king and pawn endings. So king and pawn endings are the most fundamental type of ending, since all other endings can reduce to them via piece exchanges. Therefore, the study of endgames in general must start here. And this basically is what the king pawn endgames looks like, and let's just start with all the king pawn endgames without any further ado. So the first one is the king on d6, the black king on d8, and the white pawn on e6. So you can't get much more basic than this, but even such a simple position allows us to make some important points. If white manages to promote his pawn without black immediately being able to capture the new queen, then he will win. Note that we do not cover the basic mate of king and queen versus king in this book, because of course that's very basic and all of us should know that. If black is to play, he cannot prevent white from promoting his pawn, because if you look at the board, if you go king c8 or king d8, if you go king c8, there's just e7, and now e8 queen is unstoppable. And if you go king e8, then we go e7, king f7, and then king d7, and now e8 queen is again unstoppable. Hence, in this position, if it's black to play, it's always a win for white. However, in such a position, if it is white to play instead, then this is a draw, because if you go back king to d5, black comes king to e7, now you have to go king e5, and now you maintain opposition as black, because whenever the white king enters, you go king d8 with opposition, and now whenever you give the check, you just move to king e8, and now king e6 is a stalemate. Hence, this is the most basic king and pawn endgame which all of us must know. And when it's white to play, and whoever loses the opposition, if white loses the opposition, then it's a draw, and if black loses the opposition, then it's a win for white. This is the main basis of the king and pawn versus king endgame. Okay, the second position is a pawn on e3, the white king on d3, and the black king on e5. This is a typical position of a king and pawn versus king, in which the defender's king is in front of the pawn and close to it. Unlike the previous diagram, it is a draw. Whoever moves first, play might continue. For example, if it's white to play, you go e4, king e6. You never give the opposition. You don't go king d4 because king d4 allows opposition. But even this is a draw because you can just go king e6, and now after e5 you can go king e7 instead of king e7. Hence, such openings are usually such positions are usually draws. But over here, let's just go back. So e4, king e6, and now when you go king d4, king d6, e5 check, king e6, king e4, and now you can never really get the proper opposition because whenever you go king d5, black has the opposition with king d7, and now with e6, king e7, king e5, you can again enter king e8, and we get back to the last position which we saw, because whenever you enter with either king f6 or king d6, black has king d8 or king f8 followed by a stalemate. Let's move on to the next type of position. Here the white king is on d6, black king is on d8, and the white pawn is on e5. Let's just check once if the stream is live. Alright, yeah. So with either king f6 or king d6, black has king d8. Alright, okay, coming back to the position. We've made just a small change to the diagram, pushing the white pawn one square back. White wins whoever moves first in such a position. This is because if white has the first move, then you go e6, and now black has to lose the opposition. So when he goes king e8, we just push and then of course enter the exact same position. On the other hand, if it's black to play, if you go king to c8, then we go king e7, and now we can just go king f7 and the promotion is unstoppable. And if after king to e8, we can just go king e6, and now white's the side which gets the opposition. So if you go king d8, then there's king f7 followed by e6, e7, e8, and if it's king f8, then king d7 followed by e6, e7, and e8, and hence queening is unstoppable. The next type of position is the white king on d3, pawn on e3, and king on e6. This differs from 1b only in that black's king is one square further back. White to play and now win, but he has to choose the correct move first. Okay, so now you guys tell me, what's the most important thing to do in such a position? Get the opposition. And hence white gets the opposition with king to e4, and now black has to forgive the opposition as he goes king d4 or king d7. For example, if he goes king d6, then we go king f5, and now after king e7 we go king d5, king f7 or king d7, we just go king f6, and when he goes king d6 we just push, and this is unstoppable as it queens, and this is winning for white of course. Moving on to the next type of position, we have the king on d4, pawn on c4, and black king on d8. Based on what we have seen in section 1, we can work out that what black should play to draw this position. Okay, I think you guys can remember from now on, you just need to maintain the opposition at all times. Hence, black goes king to c8 in this position. Now, after this, white has to go king c5 for example, then you can just get the opposition with king c7, and if white tries something like king d5, then king d7 gets the opposition. And from what you have seen in the earlier positions, this is always a draw because when you push c5, king c7 comes in, and after c6 you just go back king c8, and of course we re-enter the position in which king d6 is met by king d8, which maintains the opposition, and then c7, king c8, and king c6 is a stalemate. And this position is repetitive, so you must remember this sort of pattern in all the king pawn endgames because it is really repetitive. Moving on to the next type of position, we have our pawn on g5, king on e5, and the black king on g8. So long as the white pawn is on the c, d, or e or f files, everything that we have said up to now holds true, but there are a few slight differences with a knight's pawn. The basic principles are still the same, but there is one additional tricky point which sometimes catches people out. White can win in the above diagram, but he must take a little care. Okay, so in such a position, you can go king f6, okay. White is heading for the standard win, with this king on the 6th rank ahead of the pawn. Now it seems that black has nothing better than king f8, which is followed by g6, king g8, g7, king h7, king f7, king f7, king h6, g8, king h5, and then g3, king h6, and queen g8 is 6 mate, which is very standard. However, unlike what we've seen in the previous positions, after king f6, black has a good move, king to h7. And the point of this is that when you go king f7 and proclaim that g6, d7 and g8 is just queening and winning for white, black can just go back king h8 and g6 is a stalemate. And that is the tricky part about the knight endgames. However, this is still a win because after king f7, king g6 and king f7 and king h8, king g6 is the right move because now when the black kings goes to g8, we have the right move, king to h6, and now after king h8, g6 is not a stalemate because the f7 king does not guard the g8 square, and now after king g8, g7, king f7 and king h7, g8 of course queens, and this is winning for white. Moving on to the next position, we have the white king on e6, black king on e8, pawns on f6 and g5, and the black pawn on g6. Knowing the basic positions enables us to solve a lot of other positions which reduce to an ending of king and pawn versus king. How can white win here? If he could play his king round to attack black's pawn from the right, then it would be easy. But h5 is under black's control, because if you can see, white would like to just go king e5, king f4, king g6 and king g4 and try to enter with king h6, but he can't do so, and the reason for this is that the h5 square is guarded by the pawn on g6. Hence, we must obtain a new method. The most obvious continuation is f7, king f8 and king f6, right? But this is a stalemate and we don't want a stalemate over here. And over here, if we go for something else, then he can just capture the pawn. However, here there's a good move, which is king to d6. And now when he picks up the f7 pawn, we take opposition with king to d7, and now this is winning for white, because if you go for example king to f8, disallowing white from entering to e7, we just go king e6, and now when king g7 disallows king to f6, we go king e7, king h7, king f7, king h8, and now just grab this pawn. Black does get the opposition with king g8, but as we remember in the knight's pawn endgames, we just go king h8, king h6, king h8, g6, king g8, g7, king f7, and king h7, and this of course is winning for white. Moving on to the rook spawn. Alright. The situation in king and pawn versus king is very different if the attacker has two rook pawns. The left position above is winning if the pieces are on any file apart from the A and H files, but the diagram position is a draw whoever is to move. And the reason for this is when black goes king to b8, we do get the opposition, but after king a8 and a6, king b8 and a7, after king a8, whatever white does, it's a draw because king a6 is a stalemate, and king c7, black can just capture king a7, leading to a draw. This is not what we want, and hence this is always a draw. If white goes king b6, then we just always have the opposition rule with black taking opposition, and this of course is a draw again, and therefore such positions are always a draw. On the other hand, if it's like king h7, king f7 and h6, here the point is that whatever white does, this is a draw, because when you go king h8, black just takes opposition, and you try to escape, then black again takes opposition, and over here if you try to just push so that you can queen, black gives a stalemate even though you have the extra pawn, and that is the disadvantage of having rook spawns, and these endgames are usually just a draw. That's the main method. And one thing you must remember about all the h pawns and a pawns endings is that if you can get your king to a1 or b1, whether you're white or black, you just have to get your king to like the right squares, and if you can get to the corners, then such endgames are always drawn when they are king and pawn only. Moving on to the next position, we have the king on d4, black king on f1, pawns on h4 and h5. Okay, the special drawing possibilities with a rook spawn given to some usual situations. In this position, white can win the h pawn without any difficulty, but will the result lead to a winning position? Let's see. So this h pawn can easily be won because white just goes king e5 and then just wins this pawn. So if you can see, black can't really do anything and white gets this pawn. However, the point of such endgames is that black just has to get his king to h8. So if we can get like the king over here, okay, then this position, as I told you before, the black king reaches h8 and this is always a draw. Hence, the main point of all the rook pawn endgames is that if you can get your king to the corner squares of either b1 or a1 or b8 or a8 or g1 and h1 or h8 and g8 depending on the color, such positions are always drawn because because of the moves which are told before, and also because of the rules that this is always a stalemate and white cannot manage to win these positions, and always results in opposition or a stalemate. Moving on, there are a few more examples. The white king is on h1, the black king is on g3, pawns are on a3, b4, b5 and a7. Alright, if ever a king and pawn ending looked hopeless, this is it. Black's king occupies a dominant position on 6th rank and is even one square closer to the vulnerable queen side pawns than white's king. There seems nothing wrong white can do to prevent black from marching the king to the queen side and capturing both white's pawns. When the resulting king and 2 pawns against the king position in an easy win. However, using the ideas we have seen in earlier positions, white can save the game. King g1, king f3, king f1, king e3, king e1, king d3. There is nothing so far to indicate white's white's drawing idea, but now comes a surprise. We push a4, okay, and now if you just visualize this position, when black takes b into a4, imagine what happens. We march our king to a1 and b1, and as I told you before, such endgames are always drawn. So even though black has 2 a pawns, such an endgame is just going to be a draw because you can never push your pawn to a2, because then this is a stalemate or white just gets the pawn. And for example, you give away this pawn and now push this pawn instead. We just go king a1 back and again just maintain the king on these 2 squares, or the king a2 and a1 squares, and this is always a draw. And that is the main motive of drawing such positions. However, black doesn't always have to capture the a4 pawn as well. When you push a4 and you just go back to this position, black has the alternative of just going a6. Alright, but over here, let's see what they have to say. Here you just take a into b5, a into b5, king d1, king c3, king c1, and after king into b4, we just take the opposition ourselves, and now king a2 is met with king a4 is met with king a2, and king c4 is met with king c2, and white always maintains the opposition, resulting in a draw in such positions. And hence always the rook pawn endings can be extremely tricky, and the side without the pawns always have hope for just drawing such positions due to the complexities of reaching the king on the corners, which is always a draw. Moving on, the next type of position which we look at is the white king on c2, pawn on b2, and black pawn on a4 and king on f6. This position contains a trap within a trap. One's first impression is that white can just head for the a pawn. King c3, king e5, king b4, king d5, king into a4. And now we're just saying that okay, we're a pawn up, and this should just be an easy win because we have a knight's pawn as well. Nothing much. King c6, king a5, king b7, king b5, and wins. This is of course winning. However, black can use the idea of offering a pawn and converting the b pawn into an a pawn, and this is the most important thing. So if we go back to the position, over here, black itself can push a3. And this is the real point of this position, because if you take b into a3, then black just marches its king to b8 or a8, and this is again going to result in a draw. And that's the real essence of these positions, because you have to get this pawn traded off, and if white accepts that trade and gets its pawns into the a or h files, there's a lot of possibility for black to maintain the position and hold it to a draw. Now let's move on to the positions in which there are king and 2 pawns versus the king. To start with, let's start with b6, a7, king c5 and king b7. Okay, most positions with king and 2 pawns versus king are straightforward wins. There is nothing the defender can do to prevent the gradual advance of the pawns supported by the attacker's king. Eventually, one of the pawns will promote. However, there are a few positions which require a little finesse and even a few exceptional positions which are drawn. The above position, a win, but white has to employ a small degree of subtlety. So when black goes king a8, can you imagine what will happen if white just mindlessly pushes king c6? This is again a stalemate. And one thing you have to remember, in king pawn endgames, stalemates are absolute nightmares and they occur very frequently. And you always have to stay alert so that you don't commit a stalemate. So in such a position, a king a8 trap is very common. In fact, I played a Chess24 fundraising tournament only 2 days back, and in that I remember 2300 played king a8 in such a position with 5 seconds left on both of our clocks, and I almost played king c6 resulting in a stalemate, but then I managed to win this. So this is a very common trap which you must know. However, we don't have to play king c6 of course. When black goes king a8, we go king d6, king b7, and now the important move, we give a8 queen check, and after king into a8, now we go king c6, because after king b8, b7, king a7 and king c6, king c7 is of course winning with b8 queen, promotion, unstoppable. And that is the real point of playing such positions. Moving on to the next type of position, we have 2 pawns on g6 and g5, the white king on f6 and the black king on f8. Even if the pawns are doubled, then the win is usually simple, provided the pawns are supported by the king. The normal technique is to play with just the front pawn, using the rear pawn to supply a reserve tempo if necessary, when the front pawn reaches the 6th rank. However, problems may arise if both pawns are far advanced. The above position, for example, is a draw if white is to play. The only move that makes sense is one g7 check. But you can know what happens. When you go king g8, king g6 is again a stalemate. And if you try to avoid a stalemate and go something like king f5, just king g7, and now something like g6, we just go king g8, resulting in another basic draw in the positions we've done in the past. Hence, in such a position, the problems arise if both pawns are far advanced, and the only move that makes sense, of course, 1g7 is not really working. If black is to play, however, then white wins, but this requires a small trick. After king g8, g7, king h7, white cannot go king f7 because this again is a stalemate, as the h6 square is guarded by the g5 pawn. Hence, over here, again we have to be a bit more patient. And of course, you have to play the move g8 queen check, king g8, and now we get the opposition. And of course, we must not speed this up. After king h8, king f7, king h7, g6, d7 and g8, followed by queen g3 and queen d6 mate, of course. And that is how we win such positions. Moving on, what happens if the white pawns are on b3 and a4 and the black king is on b4? If the attacker's king is not yet supporting the pawns, then the question is whether the defender can capture the pawns before the king arrives. In many cases, this is impossible because 2 pawns can often defend themselves, and this is a scenario. Over here, the black king can never capture the b3 pawn regardless if white has a queen or not, And this is because a5, a6, a7 and a8 cannot be stopped after you capture the b3 pawn, because once you go king a5, the black king can never box out the white pawn, and hence these two pawns are always uncapturable, and wherever the white king, even on h8 perhaps, you just get the king to b6 and now push the a pawn, and that is the way to win such positions. On the other hand, if it's like a3 and c3 instead, or h3 or f3 instead for this matter, with the king on g5, in such positions again you can go king f4, and over here the difference is that you can actually go and capture one of these pawns, but whenever the black king goes to f4 or h4, we just push the other pawn, and now this is again the sort of position in which we can't really do anything, because after king h5 and king g6, we again push this h pawn, and king f5 or h5 will result in f5, and we always make this sort of fortress through which black can never capture any of these pawns, and the white king arrives to the rescue. And that is how we win in such positions. Okay, now one thing all of you really need to remember is that endgames include a lot of Troitsky's or versions of studies which are extremely complex and can win in many ways. So a Troitsky is a version of a study, and this one which we're going to go over next is from Novaya Vremya in 1896. So let's set up the position. So the white rook is on b2 with the knight on a6. 1 second. And the black king is on e4 with pawns on f2, h4 and e3. And the white king, of course, is on h2. So this is a Troitsky position. There are one or two exceptional positions in which a lone king can draw against the two disconnected pass pawns. In the above position, white can draw by simply using one of these. Knight c5 check. Over here, if you go king g2, the point is that there is h3 check, and after king to f1, just h2, and both of these pawns are unstoppable. Hence, we don't go king to g2. Instead, that is knight c5 check. After knight c5, the black king goes to f3. And now, we start the real operation. After king f3, if black would have gone king f5 instead, we go rook into f2 check, and after e into f2, just king to g2. And now this one king can guard both the h4 and the f2 pawns, which is again a very interesting combination. Hence, black obviously has to go king f3 to support both of these pawns. And now if you take rook into f2, just e into f2 and f1 is unstoppable. Hence, after king to f3, we again though go rook into f2. And the point is that, okay, after e into f2, there is the amazing move knight to e4. And the point of this is that when you queen, there is knight to d2 check, king f2, knight f1, king f1 and king to h3. And hence such positions are again drawing for white. On the other hand, if you don't queen and you go, for example, a knight check, or you just capture the knight, now the white king goes to g2, and this after h3 check, you can just take the f2 pawn, and after king f4, remember the Rook Spawn endgame ideas, just king g1 back, and this is of course a draw. I think Maribel Vichush has sent a message called WineFYI. So could you please send in English instead? I don't really understand this language. So that's the Troitsky position. Moving on, we are going to the technique of shouldering away, which is the fifth technique which we must know about. Okay. Just taking a small break. Alright, let's restart. Okay, restarting. Now we're going to the technique of shouldering away. So the white pawn is on a2 and f5. The king is on a4, and black has a king on e5 and a pawn on f6. So a common feature of king and pawn endings, and indeed many other types of ending, is shouldering away. The use of your own king to keep the enemy king at arm's length. So if you know, in many other sports also, you just shoulder the other opponent so that the shooter can just go ahead and shoot. For example, in basketball, you just stand over there and let your shooter, who is better at shooting, just go past without the defender trying to actually stop him from shooting. A similar technique happens in the king pawn endgames, and the white king acts like the defender, and the black king acts as a defender, and the white king is actually shouldering the black king away. So in such a position, we go king b5, and now after king into f5, we push a4, and now the point is to just promote. And when the black king tries to come by, we just push king to b6 and don't let the black king enter. And of course, when you are pushing, then in this race, the white queen is way too fast for the black queen, and hence you can give it check and of course capture this pawn by your wish. Moving on to the next type of position, the black pawn is on f7, the white king is on f4, the white pawn is on f3, and the black king is on h1. Here is a dramatic example of shouldering away. White must win the black pawn without losing his own pawn. The direct approach fails. King f5 leads to king to g2, f4, king f3, and this is a clear draw because whenever you try to push king f6, black just takes this, and if you go king g5, there is just f6 check, leaving no room for white, because after king g4 there's just king g3, and you have nothing else but to capture the pawn on f6 now. Hence, we go back to the initial position, and over here, the right move to actually win is king to g3. This is the extreme way of shouldering black's king. Now, when the black king goes to g1, we push f4, and after king f1, we push f5. And now, when the black king tries to enter with king to e2, we have king to f4, and after king to d3, there is king e5, and now we're just going king f7. Now the plan is to just go f6, king d6, king d7, and capture the pawn, following with promotion. And this is of course unstoppable. Moving on to the next type of position, we have the king on b4, the black king on b4, white pawn on f2, and black pawn on f7. The unexpected moves which arise in shouldering away situations can easily be overlooked. In this position, an experienced grandmaster missed the winning move. The game continued king to e5. The direct approach is wrong as it allows black's king to approach the pawns. King c5, f3 or f4, king c6, king f6, f5, king d7, just going on. Okay. Okay, we'll continue with the next